At the dawn of the millennium, world leaders met at the United Nations and they made bold pledges to the world's poor. They all signed the Millennium Declaration, of which the 8 Millennium Development Goals are derived. They pledged a world where people are no longer condemned to a life of extreme poverty, the first goal, where all children would complete their basic education, the second goal, where women have equal opportunity, goal 3. They also promised to radically reduce infant mortality, fourth goal, and maternal mortality, goal 5. And they pledged to reverse the AIDS pandemic and deal with diseases like malaria, the 6th goal, and to develop sustainably, goal 7. Poor countries promised to take the first responsibility for achieving these goals. They promised to fight corruption, to spend their own money on basic education, basic health, and to be accountable to their own citizens. But for us in rich countries, goal 8 is the most important. We acknowledged that poor countries can simply not do it alone, but that we need to do a better job. More aid, better aid, debt relief, and changing the rule of trade in order for poor producers to sell their products on our rich consumer markets. Now, the world was actually on track to achieve at least the first Millennium Goals of halving the number of extreme poor. And we were close to several other goals. More kids go to school than ever in human history. And death in children, although still very high, actually have declined. But the present crisis is wiping out that hard-fought progress. And I know that Italians are also hurting because of the crisis. Jobs and pensions are less secure, and your government really faces huge budget challenges. But you should realize that the crisis is hitting much harder in poor countries, and these countries have already so few resources to cope with the consequences. And they were the least responsible, but they are now bearing the brunt. Human costs are dramatic. Governments are slashing budgets. They're cutting in investment in human development. Unemployment continues to rise as producers lose markets, both locally and internationally. And we know what happens in times of crisis. There's more hunger because people can afford less food and less nutritious food. There's more disease because people cannot afford to go to clinics. And there's less school enrollment and more child labor as people take their kids from school and girls go first. And on top of all this misery, donor countries are now discussing cutting budgets of aid for poor countries. And these budgets were already well below the committed level. In fact, the gap between what was promised and actually given was already $24 billion. And actually, the biggest chunk of that $24 billion gap is the difference between what Italy promised and actually delivered. Today, Italy actually gives less aid in euros than much smaller countries like the Netherlands and Sweden. And the most worrying trend is actually the drop in aid to particularly Africa. And again, Italy carries a lot of responsibility for this. Now, this all has a devastating impact on the achievement of the Millennium Development Goals. And we simply cannot afford to let the current climate threaten to reverse this hard-fought progress towards the goals. What it takes is that governments stick to their promises. We at the United Nations, we can create the platform for our member governments to make beautiful speeches and promises. But we cannot send the police to a country if it doesn't live up to it. It's only the national citizens and their parliaments that can hold national governments to account. And in many rich countries, citizens are not even aware that these promises have been made and about the extent that their governments are actually failing to keep them. Now, during your conference, I think you would mostly focus on discussing how you cooperate with your African partners. But I do hope that you realize that these very worthy initiatives, however multiplied, will never add up to compensate for the tens of billions promised but not delivered by national governments. And that is particularly the case in Italy. So let me now emphasize how local authorities in rich countries can have a tremendous impact by using their office to raise awareness among their own citizens about development issues and the Millennium Goals, and to generate citizens' pressure on national governments. Because governments will only live up to their promises if they're pressured by their own electorate. So citizens need to be well informed, and local authorities as elected bodies have the legitimacy to actually canvass governments on behalf of their citizens. Now let me mention some successful examples of how local authorities help build awareness among their citizens. In Spain, many cities organize every year a week around the Millennium Development Goals. The city of Frankfurt dedicated its annual White Night, the night that all musea stay open, to promote the goals. Across Europe, many cities use their annual film festival, like Milan, or their annual rock festival, like Lisbon, or their youth festival, like Bayreuth in Germany, for this purpose. And in Germany, actually, a large group of mayors use their political weight to pressure members of parliament to live up to the commitments. Now, where local authorities can influence the school curriculum, many make sure that it indeed covers the issues of world poverty and the Millennium Development Goals. Now, let me, for further inspiration, just refer you to the brochure I wrote, which is titled 8 Ways to Change the World. And you can get it at the Italian campaign's website, campagnadelmillennio.it. And I hope that you will do your bit as part of the first generation that has the knowledge, has the resources to put an end to extreme poverty. As Gandhi said, the difference between what we do and what we are capable of doing would suffice to solve most of the world's problems. Now, fostering your citizens' awareness and action to hold your government to account, to simply implement what they already promised at international conferences time and time again, is something that you are perfectly capable of doing. Because the Millennium Development Goals are not just about yet another generation in poor countries never seeing the inside of a classroom. They are also about not yet another generation growing up in rich countries who have no clue on the way their peers live in poor countries and how their own society shares responsibility for that plight. Thank you.